So the first batch of 3 questions or comments to what Adam had to say in his lecture. Who would like to start? Please. Anybody else right away? Okay, you're still thinking. Good.
Yes, that's better.
I asked because of the Saudi Arabia, for example, because most of the people who work and live there have not normal rights, and therefore my question: what is your program for transition or revolution in these monarchies?
Yeah. Thomas, do you want me to answer that or take a few questions to start with?
I think because it's a quite big question, I think it would be a good idea that you answer right away.
Okay, sure. So that's an excellent question. And again, I think to answer that question, we need to place it in the regional context. The Gulf monarchies historically have really been at the center of reaction, political reaction in the region. And for that very reason, for all of the reasons that I've described, their place in American power, their connections earlier with Britain and British colonialism in particular, the revolutionary movements, left movements in the Middle East have very clearly identified them as obstacles to radical transformation. So through the 70s, 60s and 70s, there were strong, in the Arabian Peninsula, strong revolutionary left-wing movements that sought to overthrow these monarchies. This was really important as part of the struggles in Dhofar and also in Yemen. But even in places like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, you did have communist movements, workers' movements that were militating against the regimes and were part of a broader regional left struggle. Now, what happened after the 1970s is that this is when this system of predominantly, we saw a kind of right-wing shift, the restoration of the power of these monarchies, and the emergence of this very distinctive class structure based on migrant workers. Having said that, it doesn't mean, the migrant workers are the majority of the labor force in all of these 6 Gulf monarchies. However, in some of these countries, like Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain in particular, Bahrain is very important here, and also in Oman, we do see sizable citizen populations who are poor. You know, their positions might be better than the average migrant worker, but they do also suffer from poverty, from exclusion, sharply hierarchical social structures. So that is why in 2011, with the Arab uprisings, we did see echoes of that very clearly in the Gulf, in particular in Bahrain and Oman, where we saw protest movements and struggles against the monarchies. Those were defeated, partly due to Saudi intervention in Bahrain was a big turning point. So I would say, what's the prospect? Partly understanding those things, but I think the real vehicle for change has got to be going back to that moment of the 70s and the 60s, where we saw the prospect of a regional transformation, regional movements that identified the Gulf monarchies as the problem. That is why the United States plays such a key role in this, because they guarantee the survival of these monarchies because of the particular place in American power. So, I really, 2011, the uprisings that happened in 2011 really did, throw into question this kind of regional order, which is why the Gulf has played such a major role in beating back and trying to shift the direction of those struggles. So I don't think there's any hope of fundamental change simply looking internal to those states. We need to think about that bigger regional transformation.
Thank you, Adam. More questions? You're also allowed to make comments, obviously. Adam, it seems that you made the audience so thoughtful. Does it help? Hilft es euch vielleicht, wenn ihr eine Frage auf Deutsch sagt und ich übersetze sie? Vielleicht ist manchmal auch die Sprache eine. I was offering translation assistance just in case somebody would like to ask a question in German. Angela.
Ich würde gerne mal anschließen, was er meint, welche Auswirkungen der arabische Frühling gehabt hat und ob man davon noch etwas übrig geblieben ist.
Adam, Angela's question is, do you think that there is anything left from the Arab Spring?
Sorry, Thomas, I can't make that. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Is there anything left of the Arab Spring movement? Is there any discernible residues of it?
Yes, excellent question. So, you know, I think it's important to understand the trajectory of those uprisings. They were a critical, real turning point, 2010, 2011, and the years that followed. They resonated across the entire region, and the fact that, you know, it wasn't just confined to Tunisia or Egypt, but, you know, resonated from Morocco all the way through to Bahrain, really shows the commonalities that were faced by the people in the region. Now, what happened, as I mentioned just previously, is that there was a variety of different attempts, both by Western states, but also very prominently by the Gulf monarchies, to kind of restore the old regional order. So in Egypt, the Gulf, first Qatar and then Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and Kuwait backed the restoration of authoritarianism under Sisi in Egypt. Similar processes in Tunisia. They've intervened very directly in Libya, in Syria, of course, backing various forces, and now working closely with the new government in Syria. So, you know, and Sudan is obviously a very clear part of this. Yemen is another clear example where the Saudi and UAE intervention is very direct. So that was one strand, if you like, of counter-revolution. Then, of course, it is important to note that we saw a second wave of uprisings unfold in the region in 2018, 2019. And this was centered upon Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Sudan, this kind of like second Arab uprisings, if you like, in states that were somewhat insulated from what had happened in 2011, those countries. So, you know, resurgence of popular mobilizations, protest movements, etc. Now, that was cut short because of the COVID pandemic. COVID really did hit the region quite severely, and in those uprisings were basically cut short through the pandemic. And then after that, we've had now, of course, the war in Palestine, and now in Iran, in Lebanon, and so forth. So I would say, in terms of the space for popular mobilization, it's not evident for reasons that are clear today because of this kind of militarized conflicts that we see. However, I do think it's important to acknowledge the kind of political and psychological, if you like, impacts of this kind of cycles of uprisings over the last since 2011. There is a lot of kind of, I think, a deeper understanding of the problems with capitalism in the Middle East, the understanding that this is not just a question of dictators or authoritarian rulers, but is embedded with the kind of economic programs that have been pushed in the region by the World Bank and others since the 1980s. So there's an understanding of the political and the economic as being quite fused. There's a deeper understanding, I think, of the reactionary role of the Gulf states within all of this, in particular Saudi Arabia. So, you know, I'm not, in that sense, and also, of course, the centrality of Palestine to all of these questions. So I'm not pessimistic in that sense. I do think that those kinds of changes to political consciousness are longer lasting and quite deep. A lot of people, millions of people, were drawn into political action for the first time over the last decade. Millions of young people mobilized and, you know, involved in political debate and discussion in ways that the region hasn't seen since the anti-colonial struggles of the 60s and 70s. So the aftermath of those movements, I think, are real, and they will reappear because none of the fundamental problems with capitalism in the region have been addressed at all.
Thank you, Adam.
Wer ist zuerst? Okay. Kommst du nach vorne? Das Problem ist offensichtlich, dieses Mikrofon beschallt unseren Raum, erreicht ihn aber nicht. Das scheint das Computermikrofon zu sein. Also wenn du einfach so da reinsprichst.
Ja. My question is, what's the actual situation of the left parties, organizations, for example, PFLP, the People Front of Liberation of Palestine, or the People's Front of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or in Iran, and with the Kurds, in Kurden.
So I missed the last part of that question. What was the very last part?
The last one was about the Kurds.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to give a straight, simple answer to that question. All of those parties you mentioned continue to exist, continue to mobilize. One of the aspects of this that I didn't get a chance to really talk about was, of course, the Oslo process of the 1990s. I'm sure all of you there are familiar with this moment of the 1990s so-called peace accords, but I think that's an incorrect way of describing them. And what those Oslo negotiations did was, I think we really need to see Oslo, the 1990s agreement, as a continuation of settler colonialism in Palestine. It was American-backed and European-backed project that established the Palestinian Authority. And basically the Palestinian Authority, as everyone is aware, is based, headquartered primarily in the West Bank. Its role has been to act as kind of a mediator with the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. It's played a fundamental role in the arrest and detention of Palestinian activists. So the reason I'm speaking about the Palestinian Authority is that it's very difficult to understand the left without also understanding, unfortunately, the way that some of those left organizations have been incorporated into the PA authority ruling structures in the West Bank. So that's part of the problem, is that many of their structures actually depend upon kind of financial connections and support of the PA. So while they exist, while they continue to mobilize, and in Gaza and in elsewhere they have structures outside, I think they were quite weakened, to be frank, by their relationships with the Palestinian Authority. In Iran, I mean, again, we've seen in Iran, mobilization. 2019, of course, was a big moment. We've seen continuing struggles of the Kurdish populations, not simply in Iran, but also Syria, Iraq, Turkey. But I think part of the bigger problem of the left is clarifying the kind of these regional dynamics that I've spoken about. I think the Arab left in general and the Iranian left have been overly influenced by Stalinism and by the kinds of following Arab nationalism, subordinating politics to kind of national questions, and really we need to, I think, rebuild this kind of Marxist understanding and the centrality of class, understanding the ways that class fits into these national and other democratic struggles, which, to be frank, is not. I think those kinds of lessons have been lost amongst many of the left organizations in the region over the last few decades.
Thank you, Adam.
Kannst du bitte übersetzen?
Ja.
Also, ich habe verstanden, dass in den Golfmonarchien das Proletariat zum größten Teil aus migrantischen Arbeiterinnen besteht. Und gibt es trotz dieser speziellen Schwierigkeit irgendwie nennenswerte Ansätze zur Selbstorganisation?
The question is that under the conditions where the bulk of the proletariat in the Gulf region is made up of migrant workers, is there any significant momentum towards self-organization?
Okay, yes, another very important question there. Firstly, let me just give you a little bit of a bit more picture of where these workers come from. So originally, through the 1970s and 1980s, the majority of migrant workers in the Gulf came from the wider Arab region. So we're talking here about Palestinians, Yemeni, Lebanese, Jordanian, Egyptian workers who came and worked in the Gulf. Since that time, there has been a shift in the national origins of these workers. They don't now primarily come from the Arab region. The majority are from South Asia, from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, some significant Filipino population, Chinese workers as well now, as well as some East African and parts of Kenya and elsewhere. So it's about, the Arab population used to be about 70%, now it's about 30%. There's been a kind of shift in the national origins of these migrant workers. Now, the reason for that shift was partly to do with what I was describing earlier, in that the Gulf rulers were very wary of kind of the potential for Arab solidarity, if you like, in the Gulf. They saw the problems of having a large, dispossessed, non-citizen Arab workforce alongside a citizen Arab workforce, and the potential for that to disrupt politics in the region. So this shift to South Asian workers kind of more segmented and divided class structures in the Gulf. And what this meant, we need to put alongside of this the fact that the Gulf laws in the Gulf ban any kind of trade union mobilization, any kind of political actions, any kind of strikes are banned. So, of course, these things do happen, people, because of their conditions of work, low wages, precarious situation, they do protest, they do go out on strike. Construction workers in the UAE are regularly protesting and striking. But what happens in these circumstances is that the leaders of these actions, or the workforces in general, simply get deported legally. This is legal because of the legal structure governing labour in the region. So they're sent home. They're sent back to India, Pakistan, and so forth, and that's kind of typically been the ways in which labour protest movements have been responded to. Now, so it's difficult for there to be space in the Gulf for kind of organisation. However, what we do see is in the sending countries, in the Philippines, in India in particular, attempts by workers and trade unions to some degree, and left organisations, to organise more directly around work conditions in the Gulf. And I think that's an important aspect to thinking about the rebuilding of a left politics, is to really centre the question of migrant workers, non-citizen populations, as part of the region's working classes. That if we look, for example, and here I'm going beyond the Gulf, if we look, because there's been such massive experiences of war and conflict in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, there's huge populations of dispossessed refugees. People have been pushed across borders into Lebanon, into Jordan from Syria, for example. And these refugees and displaced peoples, they're not simply refugees, they are also workers. They are integrated into the region's working classes in Lebanon and Jordan. In Lebanon, about a quarter of the workforce is made up of Syrian refugees today. So again, we need to, I think this is a challenge facing the left, is to think about how these non-citizen workers are actually part of the region's working classes and need to be thought of in terms of solidarity, and part of that is building these cross-border connections with movements, with unions and other left forces in India and elsewhere.
Thank you, Adam. Any more questions, comments? Michael.
Ja, frage ich nochmal, was die Rolle des Irans in diesem großen Bild, das er am Anfang gezeichnet hat, wie er die Rolle Irans darin beschreiben soll, wie man das besser verstehen kann, was da jetzt passiert. Bitte.
You were mentioning at the beginning and in your lecture a couple of times the necessity to see the big picture, the whole region and the capitalist system as a whole. How would you describe the role of Iran in that big picture?
Yeah, I mean, Iran is, it's obviously a capitalist state. It's a state that has sat after 1979. So maybe I should step back a little bit. I described the post-war regional order and the particular alliance between the US and Saudi Arabia and Israel as part of this. Iran was part of that as well. Up until the 1979 revolution, the Pahlavi monarchy in Iran was a central component of American hegemony in the Middle East up until 1979. And all the things that I've discussed in relation to the Gulf were also very evident in connection to Iran in terms of the US support for that monarchy, the US sales of weapons to Iran, the recirculation of petrodollar wealth from Iran into the United States were all very evident. Now, through the 70s, of course, we see the emergence of these radical left movements, communist movements, and of course the Islamist movements that culminate in the 1979 Islamic Revolution that overthrows the Pahlavi monarchy. After that, immediately after that, through the 1980s, we see a very brutal war between Iran and Iraq. And that war was really fed by the United States, actually supporting both sides and seeing both sides as a weakening of both sides as part of its strategic objectives in the region. Since that time, Iran has obviously sat outside of the American kind of dominance. It's been one of the major regional powers outside of the kind of direct relationships that I've described the US has with others. Iran has attempted to project its own interests in the region through supporting Hezbollah in Iran, through supporting groups in Iraq, particularly after the American-led war in 2003, in Yemen and elsewhere in the region, tried to influence, if you like, politics through these proxy forces. It has simultaneously built a relationship with China in terms of its oil exports, which are significant, but at the same time, because of the sanctions regime against Iran, there is much of the oil industry lacks the infrastructure, particularly the refining infrastructure, necessary to kind of do those downstream activities that I spoke about. So, Iran is important. It's important, obviously, because it has presented a counterweight to American power in the region, which is clearly what this war is about today. However, I think we also need to understand that Iran, as I said, is a capitalist state. It has a ruling class, capitalist ruling class, that's very clearly connected to the Islamic regime, the Revolutionary Guards in particular, fused with the state in that kind of way. And of course, that regime has been the subject of repeated political mobilization over the last decade or so, different attempts, whether it be around the women's movement most recently, whether it be around the Kurdish populations or worker actions. So I think it's really important not to kind of fall into this kind of false Manichaean anti-imperialist perspective, where just because Iran sits outside of the United States that we should support that Iranian regime. We need to understand these regimes as capitalist regimes, and as such be part of and support the movements against them, while obviously opposing wholeheartedly foreign attacks, the bombing that we're currently seeing, and of course sanctions against Iran.
Thank you, Adam. Weitere Fragen? Ja.
Kannst du ihn fragen, bitte, ob das Thema Klima und Umwelt überhaupt ein Thema ist in der Gesellschaft und bei der Politik, bei den Erdöl produzierenden Ländern, und ein anderes Thema, ob er direkten Kontakt nach Gaza hat, ob er da, was erfährt überhaupt noch?
There are two questions actually. The first question is in how far things like the climate crisis and ecological issues are present in public discourse in the oil-producing countries of the region. That is question two. Question one. The question two is, do you have any let's say, direct links to Gaza? Is it still possible to have an idea what is going on there right now?
Yeah. Yes, the question around the ecological, this is a really, really important point, I think, because as we see the climate catastrophe emerging globally, the Middle East really is being heavily hit by various aspects of this, whether it be warming temperatures. We can see this in the Gulf. This is the irony of the situation, is that they are major oil and gas producers. They are major actors in attempting to block any effective climate response globally, but at the same time, the effects of warming temperatures in the Gulf are extreme. We see record temperatures, 45, 50-degree temperatures now being reached in places like Kuwait and elsewhere. We see flooding occurring in places like Dubai last year or this year. So these kinds of extreme weather events are occurring with repeated frequency. I think it's very clear that the region is going to be hit by these kinds of extreme weather events at a faster pace than elsewhere in the world, in many other places in the world, just because of where it is. Of course, the way in which the Gulf states are responding to this emergency is by, and this is an important point to emphasize, is by increasing the production of oil and gas. The Saudi oil minister said last year that every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. So there's no sense in which these states are saying, okay, we recognize this crisis and we're not going to deal with it. However, at the same time, and this is very important, they are also accelerating their rollout of renewable energy, solar in particular. And this might seem strange. Why are these fossil fuel powers both pledging on one side to increase oil and gas, but on the other hand, rolling out solar and wind? And the reason for this is actually quite straightforward. What they see at the moment, the Gulf states are one of the largest kind of consumers of electricity globally, partly because of the kind of industrialization patterns I've discussed. And what they are attempting to do is, at the moment, most of the electricity is produced through gas and oil. What they are attempting to do is shift a larger component of electricity production to solar in order to free up more oil and gas for export. So it's not about curtailing fossil fuel production, it's about increasing and valorizing more oil for export through the rolling out of solar. So that's why, if you look at the renewables capacity statistics, renewable energy statistics, the Gulf states are actually leading now the Middle East in terms of renewable energy because they're wanting to expand their production of oil and gas through allowing electrification through solar and stuff. So that's one side. The other aspect of this, of course, is that there's a kind of perverse self-reinforcing cycle that the climate emergency is impacting the region, because with these extreme temperatures, you see further use of air conditioning, for example. So the largest air conditioner, if you look at per capita air conditioning use, the Gulf is central globally, leading the figures on this, which means more energy demand, more electricity demand, and so forth. Desalination is another aspect to this. Being a very arid and water-scarce region, there's a lot of energy that gets used to desalinating water, which is unfortunately being used, a lot of this, for data centers. You would have seen with the Trump visit to the Gulf last few weeks that a big aspect of this was locating data centers, AI centers, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which require huge amounts of water, which is obtained through desalination. So again, the Gulf is leading the desalination industry globally, which needs more energy. So it's kind of this never-ending cycle that deepens through the impact of the climate emergency. So I think there's greater awareness of these tendencies outside of the Gulf. In North Africa, there is expansion of energy infrastructure, solar green hydrogen, and wind. Most of these expansion of these kinds of projects, however, are tied to Europe's energy needs. A big part of it is the export of energy to Europe. Activists in the region are describing this as a new form of green colonialism, because what we see is the rollout of renewable energy and other kinds of energy, but it's about exporting that electricity into Western Europe. There is, I think, a bigger awareness of these issues, and there are movements now you can see in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, that really do connect this question of energy with colonialism, green colonialism, and the other aspect to this is the way that the energy sector, energy infrastructure, is being linked to the normalization with Israel. So there are projects in which you see Israeli green capital investing alongside Arab and Gulf investors in places like Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, in the green sector. So what I'm saying is that the environmental movement in the region isn't necessarily describing itself as like the environmental movement might elsewhere, but it does see, I think there's a deep connection with the kind of questions around enduring legacies of colonialism, as well as these questions of Palestine, Israel, and normalization, bound up very inseparable from these ecological questions. I do think it's very important for us as eco-socialists to think about how to build these linkages and discussions with those movements in the region. The second question on Gaza, put very simply, the situation is really disastrous and of course going worse to worse. I've said, I mentioned at the beginning, the outset, the destruction of all kinds of infrastructure. The last few weeks shooting people queued for food and aid. The indiscriminate attacks against people. I think it is. There are, of course, people always resisting and organizing on the ground, whether it be in kind of civil organization of trying to meet the needs of a population that has been now 2 years almost under siege in this kind of way. But really, I think we need to redouble our solidarity efforts in this regard, not just simply in calling on governments to impose sanctions on Israel, to hold, to stop the flows of weapons and energy to Israel, because that's what is really funding and allowing this war to continue, but also around thinking about kind of people-to-people initiatives in terms of infrastructure. Rebuilding the university sector, for example, is going to be a major thing. Rebuilding the sanitation and electricity infrastructure, all of these things that are going to require enormous resources in whatever comes next. And I think that there's going to be a struggle around making sure this kind of reconstruction is something that really meets the needs of the population in Gaza and isn't just a way of large businesses, large conglomerates, in whether it be Israeli or Gulf-based or American-based, to make a lot of money from reconstruction, which is clearly the discussions that are happening now in the American, Israeli, and Gulf post-war negotiations.
Thank you, Adam.
Versuch's zuerst auf Deutsch. Also,
Sorry, I can't. Can you come a bit closer?
So, okay.
Okay, no problem.
Na, versuche es hier. Zuerst auf Deutsch. Also, unser altes Programm für die Ölstaaten oder arabische Welt war ja also natürlich Demokratie, aber auch, dass man die Ölquellen verstaatlicht und also vergesellschaftet und aus diesem Reichtum eine wirtschaftliche Entwicklung finanzieren kann. Ökosozialisten können ja dieses Versprechen nicht geben, sondern es ist ein bisschen komplizierter. Was können man, Sie haben das jetzt vorher schon ein bisschen angesprochen, aber was ist wirklich das attraktive Versprechen, wie man aus der Armut herauskommt und eine solidarische Lösung für die ganzen arabischen Staaten oder darüber hinaus auch Iran erreichen kann? Welche Chancen haben wir mit so einem Programm? Ist nicht so quasi die alte Forderung, ja, das Öl muss weiter fließen und da nicht so wie die Klimabewegung das fordert, es muss im Boden bleiben, realistischer, wenn man sagt, ja, das muss halt ausgebeutet werden, um die Armut zu überwinden, das kann man nichts machen, also dass das eigentlich ein unauflösbarer Widerspruch ist.
This comrade is really enjoying torturing me as a translator. Okay. Traditionally, we had the idea that the oil industry had to be nationalized and programs setting up to overcome poverty in the region using these resources and so on and so on. Now we face a situation that in terms of the unfolding climate catastrophe, there is the reasonable idea that the oil should not endlessly be extracted, and of course there is a certain contradiction between these two ideas. How, as eco-socialists, can we develop a set of demands that is getting things attractive on the socialist side and getting things attractive on the ecological side, so making something coherent of this eco-socialist approach.
Yeah, that's another excellent question. Thank you. A very and not a straightforward question. There is this. If we look again back in the anti-colonial ferment of the 1960s and 1970s, one of the main demands that was on the Arab street by the nationalist movements, by the left movements, in places like Iran as well, obviously in the revolutionary movements there, was the idea of Arab oil for the Arabs. We need to take this resource and use it for the good of the people, and to deal with the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of poverty, etc. Now, what happened is that there was the nationalization of oil that took place with OPEC and through the 70s and 80s. So now the majority of the world region's oil is controlled by local governments like Saudi Arabia. However, that oil wealth is not being used for the good of the people in the region. It's being used either for deepening the power of states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, or being reinvested in weapons systems or back into US financial markets, as I've described. It's not about, in fact, what's happened in the last 20 years, very, very clearly, is very deepening polarization of wealth between the Gulf states on one side and the rest of the population and the rest of the region on the other. Very deep polarization of wealth and power. So, as I've said, I think as eco-socialists we need to really foreground the role played by states like Saudi Arabia in the global oil economy today. Of course, I'm not saying that we don't need to deal with, ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP and so forth. They remain major actors and problems. But in the role that these national oil companies are playing, both as producers of oil and downstream products like plastics, is very important to understand today. In fact, the second biggest or third biggest petrochemical producer today is Saudi-owned. We need to think about the role that these companies play in the industry as a whole, not simply as crude oil. So that's one thing. We also need to recognize, I think, the role these institutions or companies play and countries play in blocking and shaping the direction of the world's policy making around the climate crisis. As I said, we saw that in the COP process. We saw it, for example, last year in the plastics treaty negotiations that took place in South Korea, in Busan, South Korea, where the idea was to have a treaty to limit the production of plastics. That was blocked essentially by Saudi Arabia, didn't let that treaty go through. So we see these states playing a very interventionist role in shaping the world's response to the climate crisis, along and parallel with, and in the same line as, the big Western oil companies like ExxonMobil. But what is different in the case of the Gulf is that because these are oil industries that are fused with state power, they have a seat at the table where these policies are being negotiated and decided upon. So they actually directly impact and write and decide and vote on these kinds of treaty negotiations and policy proposals. So I think what it does is again, it's not a simple answer, but I do think as eco-socialists we need to better strategize around the role of these states. We need to highlight and understand better what these states do and how they act and how they're integrated with the global oil economy as leading partners, not simply as extractive resources. So there's that kind of educational and agitational side of things. I think there's ways we can highlight the role of these states and companies in kind of greenwashing efforts, like whether it be in sporting events. It's very obvious the way in which the Gulf states play a major role in sporting events these days, sponsoring of football teams, those kinds of things. And I think trying to carefully explain the ways, the kind of regional questions. I keep coming back to this point, but I think it's important that, Palestine, if Palestine is liberated, if the Palestinian struggle pushes forward, that is going to weaken the position of the Gulf and our oil-centered global economy, inevitably. We need to see solidarity with Palestine as part of fighting for climate justice. Again, it's thinking about the ways these regional power structures have evolved over the last few decades, and the place of the Gulf in the bigger picture means foregrounding solidarity with movements, people's movements that might not immediately be connected or obviously impacted with the Gulf, but are very much integrally part of the struggle for climate justice.
Thank you, Adam.
Meine Frage ist kurz. Hat vorhin gesprochen von der Notwendigkeit, die Haltung zum arabischen Nationalismus, die wir in den 60er und 70er Jahren hatten, zu überarbeiten, sage ich mal vorsichtig. Ich finde das einen sehr wichtigen Gedanken.
Kannst du das Mikro benutzen, dann kann man nicht hier hinten, die das auch verstehen.
Okay. Also er hat vorhin gesprochen von der Notwendigkeit, die Haltung, die wir in den 60er und 70er Jahren hatten gegenüber dem arabischen Nationalismus, zu überarbeiten, zu überdenken. Das finde ich einen ganz wichtigen Gedanken. Aber ich hätte gerne, dass er sich darüber etwas näher auslässt, was das bedeutet. Denn wir erleben ja, gerade in der Solidaritätsbewegung mit dem palästinensischen Volk, erleben wir ja, dass es eine gewisse Rückbesinnung oder Verstärkung, sage ich jetzt mal, dieses Aspektes gibt. Gewissermaßen, dass die Verstärkung des arabischen Nationalismus eine Stütze sei gegen die israelische Politik. So. Und genau, das würde mich sehr interessieren, wenn er das ein bisschen ausführen würde.
Early on in your presentation, you talked about the need to rethink the way that we perceived Arab nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s as socialists. We face a situation right now where, in the context of solidarity with the struggle of the Palestinian people, this very idea of shoring up Arab solidarity against the Zionist aggressor again takes on some relevance. So could you elaborate a bit on your idea? What does it mean to rethink this attitude of the 1960s, 1970s? What are, on what line do we need to develop?
Yes. Yeah, it's a very long and complicated question, and again, a very good one. I think the problem with a lot of the kind of nationalist movements, I mentioned Nasserism, for example, but also the left kind of understandings in the various communist parties and left movements in the region, were quite deeply influenced by Stalinist conceptions, I think. In particular, and what I mean by this is kind of this stagist view, where the idea of national liberation led by the national bourgeoisie needed to come first, and after that then we can talk about socialism. So it was in many ways tail-ending the bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, in the region. Obviously this is not simply a phenomenon that's evident in the Arab world or the Middle East as a whole, but it was part of a broader picture. So what I think the problem with this perspective is that Arab nationalism, even though it did have an anti-colonial dynamic that I've spoken about, even though it was critical to breaking with British and French colonialism, and also challenging in many ways American power. It was an important part of the movements that I discussed in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen and elsewhere. It did tend to prioritize capitalist development and the national bourgeoisie. Tail-ended the national bourgeoisie. And the questions of socialism and communism were kind of left to the side. And so it became, in the case of Egypt, for example, Arab nationalism became a vehicle for the development of an Egyptian bourgeoisie, Egyptian capitalism. And I think this is directly connected to kind of Stalinist conceptions of the national struggle, and kind of subordinating these struggles to the interests of the Soviet Union at the time. So that legacy, I don't think, has been really reconciled well in the region. I think if you look at 2011, some of these debates resurfaced, and there was a tendency of people on the left and also movements in the region to kind of come back and take the Egyptian case, come back and say, well, our task now is to build a our Egyptian capitalism, to strengthen our national economies, etc. And what does that mean? It means essentially it led directly to the reconstitution of authoritarian capitalism under the military in Egypt. The same thing happening in Tunisia. So I think that's one of the things. I think part of this is to understand the political and the economic are not separate spheres. That actually the forms of political rule in the region, these kinds of authoritarian, dictatorial states, are very much part of how capitalism operates. And if we're going to deal with authoritarianism and make more democracy, we have to deal fundamentally with capitalism as a social system, the polarization of wealth, all of the economic policies we've seen through the neoliberal era. So that is what I mean by reckoning with Arab nationalism. I think the other part of this is also thinking about it at the question of the regional scale and the place of the Gulf, the place of Israel in the broader regional dynamics. That these problems and questions can't be solved inside Egypt or inside Gaza or inside Lebanon. They have to have a regional dimension and challenge those key pillars of imperialism in the region as well. So that would be my maybe not so short answer, is to thinking about it that way. And obviously that doesn't mean that we can't, that we shouldn't understand national liberation as part of the anti-capitalist struggles. That is absolutely not what I'm saying, but seeing them as very much linked and not separate stages.
It looks like it would be interesting to invite you for another lecture to elaborate on this. There's one more question.
Ich kann es versuchen kurz zu sagen. Also mich interessiert, aus der ökosozialistischen Perspektive interessiert mich die Frage, ob du, Adam, Akteure in der Region siehst, die in der Entwicklung sind, den Herausforderungen gerecht zu werden. Also ich sehe, weiß der Teufel, die Gewerkschaften im Iran sehe ich. Ja, die, glaube ich, sind ein Teil des Akteurs. Aber in Israel siegt sich zu Tode. Die palästinensische Linke sehe ich nicht. In Sudan wird diese große Gewerkschaft von 2 militärischen Fraktionen totgeschlagen. Mich interessiert, gibt es in der Region Akteure, die diesem regionalen Anspruch in irgendeiner Weise in der Entwicklung nahe kommen können? Habe ich verständlich?
Are there any actors who are capable of taking up the challenge of becoming a significant force on a regional scale, to take up all these challenges of social struggle, of national liberation, of ecological challenges, and so on. The Comrade says he knows of some trade unions in Iran who are somehow actors of some significance, but for the rest of the regions, he would not be able to cite any such examples. Can you provide any more on this to us?
I mean, I think it's. I mentioned the second wave of the Arab uprisings, 2018, 2017 to 2019, that was cut short by the pandemic. But I do think, if you look, for example, in Lebanon, at that time, there was like a really quite vibrant movement, mobilizations that took place in Beirut that were like non-sectarian or anti-sectarian in the sense that it wasn't like replicating this Shia-Sunni or divisions within the country. It was very clear around that. It was challenging all of the kind of entrenched political leaderships. And I think there was quite a vibrant debate in the various circles who were organizing around that moment in Lebanon. So, you know, I do think there are these repeated mobilizations that are occurring. I think in the case of in North Africa, I'd mention, I think there are some of the activists in Algeria, in Tunisia, some of the trade union organizers in Tunisia, that are also quite cognizant of these problems that I've talked about, and do see you know, this question of the regional scale, see these issues as something that needs to be thought through and confronted, because it's quite clear, if you look at the counter-revolutionary moment post-2011, the ways in which Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular have really acted against the interests of the region, have really directed their support to new military powers, new authoritarian leaders, being instrumental to the destruction of places like Sudan and Yemen. It's very obvious, you know, even if you don't know the details, it's quite obvious their kind of interventionist role. So it's not something that's kind of like hidden behind the eyes of activists. And I think those kinds of discussions are evident amongst people who are, you know, still active on the ground post 2011, also post the second wave of uprisings. So you know, I don't want to highlight particular people or individuals, but like I do think those debates are present.
Thank you, Adam. I think last question.
Ich habe eine Frage zu den Entwicklungsmöglichkeiten in der Region. Sprich, wie das sieht, ob es überhaupt Entwicklungsmöglichkeiten die den Menschen liegen, auf Grundlage, also mit sozialem Fortschritt, mit ökologisch nachhaltig ist. Und ich möchte jetzt auch das Stichwort mit einer Industrialisierung der Region einfach mal anreißen. Sprich, irgendwas, was über Wasserstoff gemacht ist und Industrien, die auf Grundlage von Wasserstoff irgendwelches Zeugs produzieren, ob das ein Thema ist, jetzt für ihn potenzielles Thema, oder ob er sagt, das ist alles jetzt auch über Industrialisierung auf Grundlage von Wasserstoff, das ist alles eher imperialistischer Quatsch.
The question is, do you see any imminent perspectives for substantial economic and social development, industrialization, but not a destructive one, but rather an ecologically sound one, for example, based on hydrogen use and the like, or is it just imperialist fantasies?
Yeah, I you know, to address directly this question of hydrogen, I firmly believe hydrogen is basically a Trojan horse for the fossil fuel industry. It's not a solution to the energy questions of energy or the climate emergency. It's very clear that the majority of the hydrogen industry today is blue hydrogen, which is basically natural gas connected to the acceleration of natural gas production, and that's the reason that the oil industry is so firmly supporting the rollout of hydrogen, and that's also happening in the Gulf, by the way. Some of the biggest hydrogen projects in the world are happening in the Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia, Oman, and UAE really highlighted hydrogen as a vehicle. So yeah, I think I talk about this in the last chapter of my book, Crude Capitalism, some of these industries, but I think hydrogen is very dangerous because it is this kind of Trojan horse for the fossil fuel industry, and that's why the oil and gas companies are really supporting the rollout of hydrogen. In the case of Europe, and I mentioned this earlier, that there's, I think, ways in which the expansion of hydrogen in North Africa is being seen as a means of decarbonizing Western Europe. But the problems with that is that the infrastructure necessary for hydrogen production means deeper confiscation of land, expropriation of populations there, and also demands for water and energy to run these kinds of infrastructures. So that's why I think framing this in the context of green colonialism is an accurate description.
Thank you, Adam. And ja, wir sind am Ende unserer Veranstaltung angelangt. Ich würde jetzt sagen, dass wir nicht allzu lange überziehen. Ich bitte euch um eine Runde donnernden Applauses. Adam, a heartfelt shukran from your impressed audience in Cologne, and hope to see you again maybe next year. So that is really an inspiration for eco-socialism.
Thank you. Thank you for being able to look with the rest of your comments.
Okay, one remark from Angela. The proceedings have been recorded, and if you don't mind, we can submit it to you before publication, but we would also like to make a publication out of that.
Okay, maybe we can, if you email me, I didn't quite capture everything, but...
We will discuss that later. Okay, bye-bye, have a nice weekend.